The clock had just struck 11:30 p.m. when Special Agent Rodriguez pulled his silver sedan onto Somerset Avenue. The streetlights cast long shadows across the empty road as he headed home after wrapping up an exhausting undercover operation. His mind wandered to the hot shower and comfortable bed waiting for him, a small reward after 3 weeks of careful work building trust within a suspected drug trafficking ring. The night air was crisp, and the residential streets were quiet except for the soft purr of his car's engine. Rodriguez had loosened his tie and rolled down the windows slightly, letting the cool breeze help keep him alert for the final stretch home. He'd been careful to follow all traffic rules, knowing that late-night driving often attracted extra attention from local law enforcement. The sudden flash of blue and red lights in his rearview mirror caught him by surprise. Rodriguez checked his speedometer. He'd been going exactly at the limit. With 15 years of FBI experience under his belt, he knew the drill. He carefully pulled over to the right, making sure to stop under a streetlight for visibility. As he waited, Rodriguez watched in his side mirror as Officer Chen approached, noting how the officer's hand rested near his holster, a detail that made Rodriguez's trained instincts kick in. Something felt off about the approach, too aggressive for a routine traffic stop. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Chen's voice carried a sharp edge that seemed excessive for the situation. Rodriguez kept his hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, responding with clear, measured words. "Good evening, officer. My hands are on the wheel." The beam of Chen's flashlight swept across the car's interior, lingering a bit too long on Rodriguez's face and hands. "License and registration," Chen demanded, his tone notably harsher than necessary. "Officer, my wallet is in the glove compartment." "I'm going to reach for it slowly," Rodriguez said calmly, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the growing tension. He'd been in enough high-stakes situations to recognize when things could go sideways. "Don't move." Chen's command came with a slight tremor in his voice, his hand now fully on his weapon. "I didn't give you permission to reach for anything." Rodriguez took a slow, deep breath, keeping his voice steady. "Sir, I understand your concerns for safety. I'm actually a federal agent. If you look at the passenger seat, you'll see my credentials. Step out of the vehicle. Now." Chen cut him off, ratcheting up the confrontation another notch. The officer's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic, far beyond what any reasonable traffic stop would warrant. Nearby porch lights began flicking on as neighbors noticed the commotion. A few curious faces appeared in windows, some holding up phones to record what was unfolding. Rodriguez knew this moment could either escalate into tragedy or be diffused with the right approach. "I'm going to comply, officer," Rodriguez announced clearly, both for Chen's benefit and the growing number of witnesses. "I'm opening my door slowly, and I'll step out with my hands visible." The cool night air hit Rodriguez's face as he carefully emerged from his car. He could hear crickets chirping in the background, such a peaceful sound contrasting sharply with the tense situation. More cars were slowing down now, some stopping to watch the scene unfold. Chen's flashlight beam never wavered from Rodriguez's face. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." The metal handcuffs felt cold against Rodriguez's wrists as Chen secured them with unnecessary force. "Officer, if you'll just check my credentials on the passenger seat, you'll see that I'm an FBI agent." Rodriguez tried one more time, maintaining his composure even as the situation became increasingly absurd. "This is all a misunderstanding we can easily clear up." But Chen was already calling for backup, his voice carrying across the now silent street. "Dispatch, I need additional units." "Got a suspicious subject, possible false impersonation of a federal agent." As Rodriguez stood there, handcuffed beside his own car, he couldn't help but notice the irony. Hours earlier, he'd been deep undercover, working to bring down a major criminal operation. Now here he was, arrested on his own street, less than a block from his house. Little did either man know that this traffic stop would unravel something far bigger than a simple case of profiling, a truth that would shake both their departments to the core. The growing crowd of onlookers created an ocean of whispers, and the soft glow of phone screens lit up the night like fireflies. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in his handcuffs, feeling the metal bite into his wrists. A cold breeze swept through the street, carrying with it the tension that hung heavy in the air. "Listen, Officer Chen," Rodriguez tried again, keeping his voice calm and professional. "There's a simple way to verify everything I'm telling you. My FBI credentials are right there on the passenger seat, clearly visible. You can also call the local field office to confirm my identity." Chen paced back and forth, his flashlight beam dancing erratically across the ground. His behavior seemed increasingly agitated, almost nervous, which struck Rodriguez as odd for a veteran officer handling a routine traffic stop. Something wasn't adding up. "Stop talking," Chen snapped, his voice carrying a hint of something that sounded almost like fear. "Backup is on the way. We'll sort this out at the station." More neighbors had emerged from their homes now, standing in small clusters on their front lawns. An elderly woman in a floral robe spoke in hushed tones on her phone, while a young couple recorded everything on their smartphones. Rodriguez could hear fragments of their conversations. "This isn't right, and someone needs to do something." The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Rodriguez noticed Chen's reaction to the sound. Instead of showing relief at backup arriving, the officer seemed to grow more anxious. He kept glancing at Rodriguez's car, specifically at the passenger seat where the FBI credentials lay in plain view. Two police cruisers pulled up, their headlights flooding the scene with harsh white light. Officers stepped out, hands resting cautiously on their belts as they assessed the situation. Among them was Sergeant Walker, a veteran officer Rodriguez recognized from Joint Task Force operations. "Chen, what's the situation here?" Walker asked, his experienced eyes taking in the scene. Before Chen could respond, a neighbor called out from their porch, "He's arresting an FBI agent. We all heard him say it, and his badge is right there in the car." Walker's head snapped toward Chen, then back to Rodriguez. Recognition flickered across his face. "Hold up," he said, approaching Rodriguez's car and peering through the passenger window. His flashlight beam illuminated the FBI credentials lying exactly where Rodriguez had said they would be. "Officer Chen," Walker's voice carried a note of authority, "step aside for a moment." He reached into the car and retrieved the credentials, examining them carefully. "These are authentic FBI credentials. I've worked with Agent Rodriguez on several cases." The color drained from Chen's face. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his radio, but Walker stopped him. "First, let's remove these handcuffs," he said, moving toward Rodriguez. As Walker worked on the handcuffs, Rodriguez noticed Chen backing away slowly, his eyes darting between his patrol car and the growing crowd. The officer's behavior was becoming more erratic by the second. "Chen, stay where you are," Walker commanded, but it was too late. Chen had already turned and was sprinting toward his patrol car. "He's running," someone in the crowd shouted. The gathered spectators watched in shock as Chen jumped into his patrol car, engine roaring to life. Walker immediately grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, we have an officer fleeing the scene. Officer Chen in Unit 247, heading eastbound on Somerset Avenue. All units be advised, this is now a priority situation." Finally free from the handcuffs, Rodriguez rubbed his wrists as he watched Chen's patrol car disappear into the night, sirens wailing. The pieces were starting to fall into place: the nervous behavior, the refusal to check credentials, the excessive aggression. This wasn't just about racial profiling. Chen had been looking for something specific. "Sergeant," Rodriguez said, his FBI training kicking in, "I need to make a call to my field office right away. This traffic stop wasn't random. Chen was targeting my vehicle for a reason, and I think it's connected to the case I've been working on." Walker nodded grimly, already understanding the implications. "You think he's connected to your investigation?" "I think this goes deeper than any of us realized," Rodriguez replied, pulling out his phone. "And Chen just confirmed it by running. The question is, how many others are involved, and how far up does this go?" The neighbors who had witnessed everything were now talking excitedly among themselves, phones out, already sharing what they'd seen on social media. The story was spreading like wildfire, but they had no idea they'd just witnessed the first domino fall in what would become one of the biggest corruption scandals their city had ever seen. The next few hours turned the quiet suburban street into a hub of activity. Red and blue lights painted the houses in alternating colors as more police units arrived. Rodriguez stood beside his car, phone pressed to his ear as he spoke with his FBI supervisor. The crowd of neighbors had grown, their phones capturing every moment of the unfolding drama. "Yes, sir," Rodriguez said into his phone, his free hand gesturing as he spoke. "Officer Chen specifically targeted my vehicle. The way he reacted when his sergeant recognized me, he was looking for something specific." He paused, listening. "No, sir, I don't think it's a coincidence that my undercover vehicle matches the description of one we've been tracking in the drug trafficking case." Sergeant Walker approached, holding a tablet displaying Chen's police record. "Agent Rodriguez," he said, his face grim. "You need to see this. Chen's traffic stop record over the past 6 months shows a pattern. Every single vehicle he pulled over matches descriptions from your drug trafficking investigation." Rodriguez's eyes widened as he scanned the data. "Hold on, sir," he said into his phone. Sergeant Walker just found something interesting. He put the phone on speaker so his supervisor could hear. "Look at these timestamps," Walker continued, scrolling through the records. "Each stop happened exactly 2 hours after our drug task force logged similar vehicles in their surveillance reports. Someone's been feeding him information from inside the department." A young officer jogged up to them, slightly out of breath. "Sergeant, we just got a hit on Chen's cruiser. It was found abandoned behind the old factory district. But here's the weird part. Witnesses saw him getting into a black SUV. The license plate matches one from last week's drug surveillance." The pieces were falling into place like a dark puzzle. Rodriguez's supervisor's voice crackled through the phone. "Rodriguez, I'm calling in our tactical team. If Chen's working with the trafficking ring, he might lead us straight to their operation." Just then, Walker's radio burst to life. "All units be advised. Multiple reports of suspicious activity at Warehouse 37 in the industrial district. Several vehicles matching known drug trafficking descriptions observed entering the location." "That's one of the properties we've been watching," Rodriguez said, his voice tight with urgency. "They're probably trying to clear out before we can connect the dots." He turned to Walker. "How fast can you get your tactical unit ready?" "They're already gearing up," Walker replied, reaching for his radio. "But we need to move fast. If Chen warned them." The next 30 minutes were a blur of activity. FBI tactical units arrived in unmarked vehicles, their teams quickly and quietly taking up positions around the neighborhood. Rodriguez changed into his tactical gear, the weight of his FBI vest familiar and reassuring after weeks of undercover work. "Listen up," Rodriguez addressed the assembled team of FBI agents and police officers. "We've got a unique situation here. This started as a racially motivated traffic stop, but it's evolved into something much bigger. Officer Chen isn't just a cop with bias issues. He's part of a larger corruption scheme that's been undermining both our departments." Walker stepped forward, adding his perspective. "Some of you have worked with Chen. Some of you might have considered him a friend. But tonight, he showed his true colors. He's not just betrayed his badge. He's been actively working against everything we stand for." The radio chatter suddenly picked up. Multiple vehicles leaving Warehouse 37. They're splitting up, heading in different directions. Rodriguez quickly organized the response. "Walker, your teams take the north and east routes. We'll cover south and west. Remember, some of these suspects might be police officers. Be careful who you trust." As they moved out, Rodriguez couldn't help but think about how this all started, a simple drive home that uncovered a web of corruption. The neighbors who'd witnessed his arrest were still watching, now joined by local news crews who'd gotten wind of the story. Little did they know they were watching the beginning of an operation that would expose years of corruption and change their city forever. The night air carried the sound of distant sirens as the teams moved into position. Rodriguez checked his gear one final time, knowing that the next few hours would either break this case wide open or give the corrupt officers a chance to disappear into the night. Either way, there was no turning back now. "All units, move in on my mark." His voice was steady as he gave the command. "And remember, we're not just taking down criminals tonight. We're cleaning up our own house. Let's do this right." The coordinated operation was about to begin, and somewhere in the darkness, Officer Chen and his corrupted colleagues were about to learn a hard lesson. Sometimes justice comes from the very people you try to wrong. The Warehouse district loomed dark and imposing against the night sky. Steam rose from manhole covers, creating an eerie fog that drifted between the buildings. Rodriguez and his tactical team moved silently through the shadows, their training evident in every careful step. Team 1 in position, whispered a voice through Rodriguez's earpiece. Multiple subjects visible through thermal imaging. At least 12 inside the main warehouse. Rodriguez pressed his back against a cold brick wall, gesturing for his team to hold position. Through his night vision goggles, he could see movement inside the warehouse, figures rushing back and forth, clearly in a hurry to clear out evidence. Team 2, ready, came another whisper through the radio. Vehicle count is up to 8. 3 parked by the loading dock, 5 around back. 2 are marked police cruisers. The revelation of police vehicles hit hard. Everyone on the raid team felt it, the bitter taste of betrayal. These weren't just random corrupt cops, this was an organized operation within their own departments. All teams, hold positions, Rodriguez commanded softly. Wait for my signal. He watched as another figure emerged from the warehouse, recognizing the nervous movements of Officer Chen even in the dark. Chen was talking frantically with someone else, a tall figure whose stance screamed authority. Through high-powered surveillance equipment, they could pick up fragments of conversation. Everything's compromised. FBI agent. Whole operation. Need to move now. Sergeant Walker's voice came through the radio. Sir, you seeing this? That's Lieutenant Powell with Chen. He's head of narcotics. Rodriguez felt his jaw tighten. Powell was supposed to be one of the good ones. A decorated officer with 20 years on the force. Now here he was, clearly orchestrating the cleanup of a criminal operation. Suddenly, the warehouse erupted with activity. Engines roared to life, and loading bay doors began to roll up. They were making their move. All teams, execute now. Rodriguez commanded. Remember, some suspects are law enforcement. Watch your targets and identify yourselves clearly. The night exploded into action. FBI agents and loyal police officers emerged from every shadow. Bright tactical lights cut through the darkness as voices rang out, FBI. Police? Everyone on the ground. The scene devolved into chaos. Some suspects immediately surrendered, dropping to their knees with hands raised. Others tried to run, only to find every escape route blocked by tactical teams. Through it all, Rodriguez moved with purpose, heading straight for where he'd last seen Chen and Powell. Stop right there, he shouted, his tactical light illuminating the 2 officers trying to slip away through a side door. Hands where I can see them. Powell spun around, his face a mask of cold anger. You have no idea what you're doing, he snarled. Do you know how long we've had this operation running? How much money we've made keeping the streets clean of competition? Clean. Rodriguez replied, keeping his weapon trained on the corrupt lieutenant. You call betraying your badge and working with drug traffickers clean. Nearby, Chen had frozen in place, his earlier bravado completely gone. The reality of his situation had finally hit him, how his own biases and greed had led him to this moment. The raid continued around them as more officers were arrested. Evidence teams discovered hundreds of documents, computer files, and ledgers detailing years of corruption. Names of dirty cops, payment records, schedules of drug shipments, everything they needed to dismantle the entire operation. Dawn was breaking by the time they finished securing the scene. Rodriguez stood watching as Chen, Powell, and 14 other officers were led away in handcuffs. The media had arrived in force, their cameras capturing every moment of what would become one of the biggest police corruption scandals in the city's history. Sergeant Walker approached, looking tired but satisfied. We found their complete operation records, he said, holding up a laptop. 5 years of coordinated corruption. They were using racial profiling as a cover, targeting specific vehicles that matched rival drug operations, making it look like they were just bad cops with bias issues. Rodriguez nodded slowly. They thought nobody would look too closely at racist police behavior. It was the perfect cover. Until they picked the wrong target. The morning sun cast long shadows across the warehouse district as more evidence teams arrived. This was just the beginning. The documents they'd seized would lead to dozens more arrests, reaching into every level of both departments. You know what the real irony is? Rodriguez said, watching another corrupt officer being led to a transport van. If Chen hadn't let his real racial bias cloud his judgment, if he just checked my credentials like any professional officer would have, they might still be operating today. Walker shook his head. One bad traffic stop brought down their whole operation. Sometimes justice works in strange ways. As Rodriguez looked over the scene, the seized evidence, the arrested officers, the morning news crews setting up their cameras, he couldn't help but think about how this all started. A simple drive home had turned into something that would change the entire city's law enforcement landscape forever. The morning sun beat down on the police headquarters as crowds gathered outside. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Inside the building's main conference room, Rodriguez sat with the FBI task force and internal affairs officers, sifting through mountains of seized evidence. "Look at this," said an investigator, spreading out a series of documents across the table. They weren't just targeting rival drug operations, they were selling information about our undercover agents to criminal organizations. Rodriguez picked up one of the files, his expression darkening as he read. 3 undercover officers were killed in the last 2 years. We thought their covers were blown by accident. Now we know better. The room fell silent as the weight of this revelation sank in. These weren't just corrupt cops taking bribes, they had blood on their hands. The police chief entered the room, looking like he hadn't slept in days. "The press is waiting outside," he said, his voice heavy. "We need to make a statement. The public deserves to know the truth." Before they could respond, a young officer burst into the room. "Sir, you need to see this." Lieutenant Powell just started talking. He's naming names, big names. Everyone rushed to the interrogation viewing room. Through the one-way glass, they watched as Powell, still in his wrinkled uniform from the night before, spilled years of secrets. The mayor's office knew, Powell was saying, his arrogance replaced by desperate self-preservation. The previous chief was in on it too. "We had protection all the way up. Why do you think nobody looked too closely at our traffic stop patterns?" Rodriguez turned to the current chief. "We need to move fast. Anyone he names might try to destroy evidence or flee." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Search warrants were issued for officers throughout City Hall. More arrests were made, including 2 judges and a senior prosecutor who had been helping to bury evidence of police misconduct. By afternoon, the story had gone national. News helicopters circled overhead as more officials were led out of City Hall in handcuffs. Social media exploded with clips from Rodriguez's original traffic stop, now seen in an entirely new light. Back in the evidence room, a tech analyst called everyone over to her computer. "I found something in their financial records," she said, pulling up a spreadsheet. They weren't just taking bribes. They were investing the money in legitimate businesses around the city, restaurants, nightclubs, even a daycare center. "They were laundering the money in plain sight," Rodriguez said, leaning in to look at the screen. All those businesses would have seemed like perfect examples of police officers making smart investments for their retirement. The investigation spread like wildfire through the city's power structure. Each new revelation led to more arrests, more seized assets, more shocked faces in handcuffs. The corrupt officers had built an empire on racism and greed, using racial profiling as both a tool and a cover for their crimes. By evening, the police chief stood before a forest of microphones outside headquarters. Camera flashes lit up the growing darkness as he prepared to address the city. "Today, we uncovered a cancer within our department," he began, his voice firm. "What started as a wrongful traffic stop led us to uncover one of the largest police corruption scandals in our city's history. But I want to be clear, this investigation isn't just about corrupt officers. It's about trust. Trust that was broken and trust that we must now rebuild." Rodriguez watched from the side, thinking about how differently this could have ended. If Chen hadn't pulled him over, if the corrupt officers had checked his credentials, if they hadn't let their real prejudices cloud their judgment, their criminal empire might still be operating. A community leader stepped up to the microphones next. "For years, we complained about racial profiling in traffic stops. We were told it was just a few bad apples, or that we were imagining things. Now we know the truth. It was systematic, intentional, and criminal. But today, we also saw what can happen when good officers and federal agents work together to root out corruption." As the press conference continued, Rodriguez's phone buzzed with a message. Another FBI team had just arrested 3 more corrupt officers trying to flee the city. The net was closing and the house of cards was falling. Inside the evidence room, investigators continued to uncover more shocking details. The corrupt officers had been keeping detailed records of their crimes, arrogant in their belief that they would never be caught. Now those same records would be their downfall. They documented everything, an evidence technician said, holding up another file. Every bribe, every tip-off to drug dealers, every falsified report. They were proud of what they were doing. They thought they were untouchable. As night fell again over the city, the full scope of the corruption was still being uncovered. But one thing was already clear: the city's law enforcement would never be the same. What started as one biased traffic stop had exposed a criminal enterprise that reached into every corner of power, and the cleanup was just beginning. 1 week after the initial arrests, the community center was packed to capacity. People stood along the walls and spilled out into the hallway, all gathered for the first town hall meeting since the scandal broke. The air was thick with emotion, anger, hope, and determination all mixed together. Rodriguez sat on the stage alongside the police chief, community leaders, and FBI officials. He'd been hesitant to participate, but his supervisor had made a good point. His traffic stop had cracked the case wide open, and people needed to hear the full story. A community elder stepped up to the microphone first. "For years, we told you something was wrong," she said, her voice carrying years of frustration. "Every time our children were pulled over for no reason, every time our neighbors were harassed, we knew it wasn't random. Now we know just how right we were." The police chief nodded solemnly. "You were right," he admitted, his honesty drawing surprised murmurs from the crowd. "What we uncovered goes beyond a few racist officers. This was a systematic abuse of power that used racial profiling as both a weapon and a shield. They knew that complaints about racist police behavior often got dismissed, so they used that to hide their criminal enterprise." An officer in the audience stood up. "I worked with Chen for 3 years," he said, his voice shaking. "I saw him target people of color during traffic stops. I thought he was just. I thought I should have said something." "That's what they counted on," Rodriguez responded, leaning toward his microphone. "They counted on good officers staying quiet, on the community feeling helpless, on everyone accepting that this was just how things were. But change is happening right now." He gestured to a stack of documents on the table. "These are the new policies being implemented department-wide. Every traffic stop will be recorded and reviewed. Officers will be required to state the reason for stops before leaving their vehicles. An independent civilian oversight board will have real power to investigate complaints." A young activist raised her hand. "That sounds good, but we've heard promises before. What's different this time?" The FBI supervisor stood up. "What's different is that we have proof of how racial profiling was used to enable criminal activity. These weren't just biased officers, they were part of a criminal enterprise that made millions by targeting specific communities. That means we can prosecute this as organized crime." The meeting continued for hours as people shared their stories, asked questions, and demanded specific changes. Outside, news crews interviewed more community members, their cameras capturing the raw emotions of a city coming to terms with the scope of corruption that had been hidden in plain sight. Later that evening, Rodriguez sat in his office reviewing more evidence files. Each new document revealed another layer of the conspiracy. Officers who had received commendations for their high number of drug busts were actually eliminating competition for their criminal partners. Traffic stop statistics that had been defended as proactive policing were really a cover for targeting specific vehicles on behalf of drug traffickers. A knock on his door interrupted his reading. It was one of the young officers who had been at the town hall meeting. "Agent Rodriguez, can I talk to you for a minute?" The officer sat down, clearly struggling with what he wanted to say. "I've been thinking about all the times I saw things that didn't seem right but didn't speak up. There's something you should know about another sergeant in our department." As the officer shared his story, Rodriguez realized this was just the beginning. The exposure of the corruption ring had broken a dam of silence. Other officers, community members, and even low-level criminals were coming forward with information about police misconduct that had gone unreported for years. In another part of the city, community organizers were setting up a new monitoring system. Volunteers would track every traffic stop, every interaction, every complaint. But this time, they had support from within the department, officers who had seen where silence led and were determined not to let it happen again. The police academy was already implementing new training programs. Future officers would learn about how the corruption ring had operated, how they had used racial bias as a tool for their crimes, and how to recognize and report suspicious behavior by fellow officers. At the courthouse, judges were reviewing years of cases that might have been tainted by the corrupt officers. Dozens of convictions were being overturned, while other cases were being reopened with new evidence. The ripple effects of the investigation touched every part of the justice system. As night fell over the city, Rodriguez drove home along the same street where he'd been pulled over. The neighborhood looked different now, not because it had changed, but because everyone understood how close they'd come to losing their city to corruption. His phone buzzed with another message. More officers had come forward with information. Tomorrow would bring more revelations, more arrests, more changes. But tonight, for the first time in years, there was real hope for change. The wall of silence had been broken, and in its place, a new understanding was growing. Justice only works when everyone stands up for it. 6 months had passed since that fateful traffic stop. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the newly established Police Accountability Office as Rodriguez reviewed the latest progress reports. The walls were covered with charts tracking everything from traffic stop demographics to complaint resolution times. "You should see these numbers," said the Civilian Oversight Director, spreading out a fresh set of statistics. "Traffic stops are down 40%, but actual drug seizures are up. Turns out when officers focus on real suspicious behavior instead of targeting specific groups, they do better work." Rodriguez smiled, remembering how much had changed. The courthouse across the street was still processing cases connected to the corruption scandal. So far, 37 officers had been convicted, along with 3 judges, 2 prosecutors, and a deputy mayor. More trials were scheduled for the coming months. Inside the police academy, new cadets were watching body camera footage from his traffic stop as part of their training. They learned how Officer Chen's apparent racism had actually been part of a larger criminal operation and how his refusal to check credentials had led to its exposure. The biggest mistake they made, the instructor told the cadets, wasn't targeting Agent Rodriguez. It was believing they could hide their crimes behind a wall of prejudice. They thought no one would look too closely at racist behavior because it was so common. That's why change has to start with each of you. At the community center, weekly meetings continued between police officers and local residents. But now, instead of confrontation, there was collaboration. Officers shared updates on investigations, while community members provided valuable information about neighborhood concerns. Remember how tense that first town hall was? A community organizer asked during one meeting. "Now look at us, planning community events together, setting up youth programs. This is what real police work should look like." The changes weren't just local. Other cities had sent observers to study the reforms. The FBI had created a new task force specifically focused on identifying similar corruption schemes across the country. Rodriguez had been asked to help train their agents, sharing lessons learned from the investigation. Back at his old precinct, the atmosphere had completely changed. Officers who had once stayed quiet about misconduct now spoke up immediately. The fear of retaliation had been replaced by a stronger fear, the fear of letting another corrupt system take root. "Had an interesting traffic stop yesterday," a young officer told Rodriguez during a training session. "Driver matched a drug trafficking profile perfectly. Old me would have jumped at it. Instead, I called it in, ran proper checks. Turned out he was a business owner heading to a charity event. That could have been another unfair stop, another person who lost trust in us." The police chief's office had been transformed too. Where there were once award plaques, there were now transparency reports. Every week, he posted updated statistics about stops, searches, and complaints, broken down by neighborhood and demographics. No more hiding behind vague explanations or manipulated numbers. In the evidence room, technicians were still uncovering new connections from the seized documents. The corruption had spread further than anyone initially thought, but now there were systems in place to prevent it from happening again. "Found another shell company yesterday," an analyst reported. "They were smart, hiding their money in plain sight, but now we know what to look for." Other departments are already using our checklist to audit their own office's finances. The neighborhood where it all started had changed too. The street where Rodriguez was pulled over now had a small memorial, not to mark tragedy, but to celebrate change. Local artists had painted a mural showing hands of different colors joined together, with the words "Justice sees no color" written above. Evening fell as Rodriguez left the office, driving past that mural on his way home. His phone buzzed with a message. Another department had just uncovered a similar corruption ring using their new protocols. Change was spreading, one department at a time. At the local diner where officers and community members now often shared meals and conversations, an elderly resident summed it up best. What happened here with that traffic stop? That wasn't just about catching bad cops. It was about changing how we see each other, how we work together. They thought they could hide behind our divisions, but they ended up bringing us closer together. Officer Chen's old patrol car sat in the police museum, now part of an exhibit about corruption and reform. Next to it was Rodriguez's FBI badge from that night, along with documents showing how one biased traffic stop had exposed years of corruption. But more importantly, it showed what could happen when people refused to accept injustice as normal. As stars appeared in the sky above the city, Rodriguez thought about everything that had changed. The corruption had been like a disease, spreading through the department for years. But its exposure had led to healing, to real changes that made everyone safer. What started as one officer's biased decision had ended up transforming an entire city's approach to justice. In the end, that's what real change looks like, not just removing bad officers, but building something better in their place. A system where accountability isn't just a word, but a daily practice. Where trust isn't hoped for, but earned. Where justice isn't just an ideal, but a reality that everyone works together to maintain.